recording?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yeah?
Okay.
Tell us when.
All right, you're live.
Welcome everybody to Live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. For 2 straight weeks, the world might implode.
Cats, yes.
Welcome everybody. I am Pastor Dave. With me is Recovering Heretic Dan.
Yes.
And are we really going to go article by article through the Augsburg?
We're going to go article by article
All
because
right.
this is actually turning out to be pretty cool.
Okay, go for it then.
Okay.
Where were we?
So, where are we?
You might test the limits of my knowledge because I don't know if I have article by article.
Well, I went through, and that's why I want to do it article by article because there's some cool stuff in here.
There is.
And we left off as we were just getting into original sin, the Son of God, articles 1 through 3, pretty much agree with the church. But 4,
it's justification by faith.
This is where we get to where the Augsburg Confessions, I think, are the fundamental basis of Lutheranism.
Yeah.
Because Article 4 is justification by faith, and it says here that the synopsis statement was, man cannot be justified before God through our own abilities. We are wholly reliant on Jesus for reconciliation. And this is, the commentary says that the Lutheran Church stands or falls on this particular part of the confession.
Yeah, that's a line, right, Millington has. The church stands or falls on justification by faith. So, yes.
So what made this different from the Roman Church at the time, from the Catholicism, the Universal Church? What was
their line was, we are justified by faith and love, or faith and charity, is what you'll read in their language. That faith gives you the kind of, faith gives you like the starting fluid that you need, and then you've got to use that to turn your engine on and, do good works toward your neighbor and so you're justified by both these things, faith and charity or faith and love,
So at that point, the Catholic Church, it's the justification, the faith is just the starting point. Whereas for Lutheranism, it's the be-all, end-all.
Yeah, right. Or we would say you never really get beyond the starting point. We have a much dimmer view of humans than...
It sounds a lot more pessimistic.
Yeah, right. We have a dimmer view of humans than the Catholics do. They would say, right, that God's grace, which, yes, they would agree is received by faith, enables you to make the right decision to live a life, dedicated to works of charity, aka love,
It sounds like there's a difference of opinion on cause and effect here. Is that ultimately what it amounts to?
Yeah, I mean it is, because Luther says you need to do good works, yes. It's just you don't need to do them. It's who are they directed towards? Luther's popular line is, God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. And so, no, for your relationship to be right before God, you don't need to do good works. But if your relationship is right with God, you then therefore should do good works.
So in a sense, the doing of good works is a sign that you have a right relationship with God.
Yes, right. Not the reason you have a right. It's kind of an order of operations in math. We've got the same integers there, but it's what comes where in the math problem is essentially the debate,
Okay. Why is that where the Lutheran Church stands or falls? And there's a lot of theology to talk about. So why is that the one thing where this is where it stands or falls?
Well, because it all kind of comes back to, is it God's action or is it our own? You know, Luther's looking for confidence. You know, that's really what Lutherans are looking for, right? Is in what is our confidence, you know? And Luther, because he's a perennially guilty, he's got probably a psychologically guilty conscience, you know? He's always looking for a step of confidence beyond what normal people usually go towards, you know? And so for 90% of people, the whole medieval Catholic system was probably fine. You know, it was pretty simple in its operation, right? You do your best, God forgives the rest. You know, you go to Mass. If you mess up, you go to confession. If you go to confession, you do penance, you know. Occasionally you do something bad enough, you'll be asked to go on like a pilgrimage, but we've got ways and means for doing that.
So there's always a way to clear the slate.
Right, there's always a way to clear the slate. And that probably works for 90% of people, but then you get a like borderline neurotic person
Like Luther.
Who can't get this idea out of his head. How do I know I've done good enough? You know, and that whole system doesn't work for that. You know, like if I have to confess my sins, well, I've got to confess everything. You know, so Luther would spend hours in confession.
Yeah.
You know, and
he couldn't take just a blanket forgiveness.
right. You know, it's like, well, if I didn't name this, then it wasn't forgiven, and you know, and he would, you know, it'd be great to trust in the pilgrimage, you know, but what happens when I do something after the pilgrimage, and you know. And I took the pilgrimage for these sins, but all these sins I committed along the way, you know, what do I do? And on top of that, like, Luther took a pilgrimage to Rome, and he didn't really like what he saw. He saw a very corrupt city. So on top of that, it's not even like ticking the box for him, really, you know. And so, you know, you get a Luther. And again, Luther's looking for confidence, you know, and so how can we be confident? And the reason the church stands or falls on it is because as Lutherans, we would say the only reason you can end up being confident is because of Jesus' work, not our own work, you know. And so you've got to have a very clear distinction between what is Jesus' work, salvation, and what is our work, you know, sin and our works toward our neighbors, you know, like...
How does this differ? I'm trying to keep everything related to the Augsburg Confession, but how does this differ from, you know, I've seen some people have that viewpoint of like hardcore predestination, so that if you're justified by faith, people have, even in the modern era, I've seen people use that as an excuse for their own very corrupt activity. Like, you know, like 1980s televangelists who were clearly, many of them, not all by any means, but many of them were clearly just milking the system to get rich and bilking their followers. But they would say, well, I'm justified by faith, so it doesn't matter. So I can commit all this sinful stuff, that's okay, I'm justified by faith. So it becomes their get out of jail free card, as opposed to an actual theology. And so how does that differ? How would Luther explain that, let's call it an abuse of that philosophy?
Well, I mean, going all the way back to Paul, right? Paul has whole chapters in Romans on, shall we sin that grace may abound? By no means, you know, like. So it's goes all the way back to the original writer of the doctrine itself, right? You know, I mean, again, the answer is because your neighbor you know, like regardless of whether you need to do them to make God happy, your neighbor still needs, you know, your neighbor who's hungry still needs food. Your neighbor who needs clothes still needs clothed, you know.
But in the case of someone like that, televangelist, who is clearly not doing it for their neighbor, only for themselves.
Well, then you would say there's you've not really. Luther would say you've not really trusted in Christ's promises then, because Christ's promise is supposed to, he described justification by faith as like a divine back operation. Sin for Luther is what he calls being curved in on yourself. And he's like, we've all got this crooked back, which causes us to focus only on ourselves. And Luther would say, even if you're the pious person who's trying to earn his salvation through works and you're not the televangelist, he would say, but doing a good work because you're trying to save yourself doesn't make it a good work anymore.
It's still
in selfish pursuit of your own well-being.
Yeah. So it's no different than televangelists taking all that money.
Right. It's not any real different than that. And so Luther would say, the only way to fix that math problem is to say, no, you are saved. And then he says that has like this back straightening effect where suddenly you're not curved in on yourself and you can say, okay, what does my neighbor actually need? Because I have all I need. I am saved already in Jesus Christ. And then you can act out of genuine, not I'm doing this to save myself, but knowledge of I have salvation already worked out. So, okay.
I'm good. Here, you can have my code.
Right.
Whatever.
Right. That would be Luther's response.
Okay. Just got to stay on that for since it is such a hardcore aspect of Lutheranism. Article 5. I don't know what they call it, Confession 5.
Yeah, Article 5. Yeah.
The office of preaching.
Yeah.
To ensure that the gospel of Jesus is proclaimed throughout the world, Christ has established his office of the holy ministry. So, dig deep. What does that office of preaching mean? And is this something that they agree on?
No.
I know on the prior one.
This is not something they agree on.
So even the office of preaching they don't agree on. Why? So what is it, and then what is the disagreement? Because it seems straightforward.
Right, it does seem straightforward. In Luther's day, they would say salvation came through the church's sacraments, right? Partaking in the church's sacraments, and there's 7 of them, and if they follow the life cycle, and if you faithfully partake, from birth at baptism to death and last rites, and all said steps in between, you will, you have faithfully had the grace of God bestowed upon you, the Lutherans kind of said it was word and sacrament, that yes, the sacraments are there to bestow grace, and we fully believe that, but it's also word, it's the aspect of hearing the gospel message and believing it that, also brings salvation. And so part of this for Luther is what he's saying is he got accused of a lot of Protestants have this doctrine, and some say Lutherans have it, called the priesthood of all believers, which some took to mean Luther was eliminating the priesthood, which Luther wanted. And there were denominations and there were radical reformers who were eliminating the priesthood, and Luther wanted to be clear, I'm not eliminating the priesthood, I'm just slightly altering its job description,
Okay.
And so for Luther, he's saying the office of preaching is an office of the church bestowed upon the priest, and that needs to be a priest's job. That was not necessarily a priest's job to preach all the time. That's what the Dominicans were for. The Dominicans were the preaching order of the church, So
that's how you could get the Jesuits were much more studious and academic.
Right, the Jesuits were the studious order of the church. The Dominicans were actually founded as the preaching order of the church, and so...
this is interesting then, because Luther was an Augustinian.
Yes.
Who tended to be at odds with Dominicans.
Yes, he tended to fight with Dominicans. Yeah, well, he fought with a Dominican.
Okay.
John Tetzel is a Dominican, but John Tetzel, like many people in his order, he can give a good speech, right? Because they're the preaching order, so he's a good salesman. He can give a good speech, So Luther's point is, the gospel, the good news, is a part of what it means to be in the priesthood. It's an office. The office of preaching is bestowed. Preaching's a formal thing, and yes, it's given to the pastor. It's also given to all of us in our daily lives, which is what's really meant by priesthood of all believers. Is you have an obligation on Monday to go out and proclaim the good news to your neighbor, just as I proclaim it. You should all have a little sermon in your heads, basically, ready to go.
And this just occurred to me, that how relevant was that in Luther's time, given that Christianity was, through Europe, the dominant, almost all but exclusive religion.
Yeah.
So who would you preach to on Monday if everybody around you is already?
It's not about conversion per se. I mean, Luther's interested in conversion, but it's not. Luther, if you read Luther, he's full of, we've got lots of people who call themselves Christians, but if they were really converted, society wouldn't be this way, and so he's saying that line. So you need to go out and preach, because most people, even if they say they are, aren't,
Yeah.
He likes to rant about how badly behaved children are, and he's like, if children truly believe the gospel, they would behave. They would behave, right? Or if he writes a whole letter on how to be a Christian prince, and it's like, and if princes truly, lived this out, we wouldn't have any problem.
You wouldn't have war, you wouldn't have...
Right, and if lords truly lived this out, their slaves wouldn't rebel, their servants wouldn't rebel, and if...
No less true today.
If servants truly live this out, they also wouldn't rebel,
Yeah.
So he's very clear. He doesn't, even though he lives in a predominantly Christian society, he doesn't think most people are Christian. He really doesn't think that.
They haven't really absorbed it.
Right. I guess for Lutherans also, this is a difference between us and like our Reformed brothers and sisters and a lot of other Protestants, in that justification is an ongoing experience. Like, it's not a once and done thing. It's a daily thing. Daily you are justified. It's never something that's finished. And so daily you are justified. Daily you sin. Daily you are justified. Luther talks about this as like, daily we crucify the old Adam in ourselves and are raised into Jesus Christ. And which is
kind of like being a recovering Christian.
Yeah, you're a recovering sinner.
You're never really done.
Right. Yeah, you're never right. An alcoholic never stops being an alcoholic, right? Like
a heretic never stops being a heretic.
Yeah, right. Daily you're recovering, and so for Luther, daily we need to hear this message of God's free justification in Jesus Christ, and that we are sinners. Or reverse that order, right? Law and gospel. So daily we need to hear we are sinners, and daily we need then to hear, and Jesus Christ is the answer for whom we should place our trust. Because it's this ongoing daily thing. It's never this thing. A lot of Christians will talk about, I am justified. Luther will talk about, I am being justified. I am, it's never a once and done thing.
I like that.
So that is something that separates us as Lutherans, is even to this day, our Reformed brothers and sisters talk a lot about, they believe justification by faith, but it's not as central to them because it's this thing, it's this one moment or this thing that happened before, and for us it's like, no, this is a daily.
It's a continual process.
It's a continual process. There's a Lutheran theologian in the modern world who's part of something called radical Lutheranism, but he's known for saying just being made holy is simply the process of getting used to your justification. And what he means by that is like, it's not this linear growth after I've been justified. It's this daily we live into this life as Christians, and daily we mess up, and so every day you need to hear, we all need to hear.
So that's why that office of preaching
Right, is
4
important,
o'clock
not
service.
just for the pastor on Sunday mornings, but is then given to everybody else so that they can go out and proclaim,
Yeah,
you know.
and help people continue justification
Yeah.
as a process.
Yeah.
That's cool. Steve, on this note, has a question. Did the preaching have anything to do with a restriction on publishing the Bible? And to clarify, the Bible wasn't published in Luther's time. I mean, it was in that process, right? We're starting to overlap.
Yeah, right.
So did the Catholic Church not want their power preached by anyone but priests? Was it a knowledge control issue, I think? Is
Yeah.
What this gets at.
I think that I wouldn't quite put it that maliciously, I guess. I think it's I think the church was trying to keep scripture in the universal language, because it was the universal church, right? Like there's this big emphasis in Catholicism that they are universal,
Well, that's what the word Catholic means.
Right. Yeah, right. Actually, so this point is well illustrated by the new movie Conclave. Go watch Conclave, and there's this moment where they're all eating together, and the one liberal cardinal says, "Isn't this wonderful? We're all one church together," and the conservative cardinal goes, "One church? What are you talking about? You have the Africans over there, and the Spanish speakers over there, and and you've got the Germans over here, and the Americans and the English are over there, And he goes, "Before we got rid of Latin, we all would have been one church. There would have been one language, one church, one message heard. And so I think it's less about control. It's more about, in a world where there's so many languages, creating the one universal language, which is also the academic language, in a church which truly is universal and cross boundaries and is not beholden to one country, one crown.
Yeah.
You have a universal language for this thing. That's really what they're trying to do. Luther just kind of was like, oh, that's hogwash. People can't read it.
The reality is.
Right. Getting back to Luther's very down to earth, right? He's like, meh. Nice theory, but all that means is common people don't hear the story of Jesus, so I'm going to translate my Bible in German. Thank you very much.
So Luther would have been a big fan of Esperanto, this attempt to have a universal language.
Well, yeah, and you got to remember also how much harder this was because these languages actually had a lot more variety. German was not German actually gets set by Luther's translation of the Bible.
Okay, so
French actually gets set by John Calvin's publishing the Institutes of the Christian Religion in French.
wow.
The King James Bible actually helps set, and William Shakespeare, between the two of them helps set English, so it's not just a matter of the church was facing, there's German and there's France, because you'd think that's a solvable problem, but the people in Saxony might not have spoken the same type of German as the people in Bavaria, and the people in Paris spoke French, but they spoke a different kind of French than the people in Bordeaux who spoke a branch called Ottian, it really is these languages aren't standardized yet, hardly, and so, English sounds more German closer to London, but the further north you get to York, it starts sounding more Danish, because the Danelaw and all that stuff, and so I think we sometimes undersell how much language variation there was versus there's just Latin.
Yeah.
And that's
so Latin had a much bigger impact.
Right.
Given that than we suspect today.
Right. It's Latin is set, so let's just do everything in Latin, because if we try and accommodate the Saxons, and we got to accommodate the Bavarians, and we got to accommodate the Bohemians, you know, and then you're off to the races.
Yeah, that's cool. Never had that insight before. All right, we got time for just one more. This has already gone fast, and we've only gone through two. So this series may go on for quite a while.
It might go on for a while.
But from our own loft, Luther challenged the Catholic Church on the belief that you are saved by faith alone.
Yeah.
However, nowhere did Luther say that you shouldn't do good works, but stated that doesn't define your good standing with God.
Right.
Which kind of gets us, moves us back to the beginning conversation.
So they blamed him for something he never said.
Yeah. So did they claim him for something he never actually said? Or blame him, blame him.
Did they blame him for something he never actually said?
Yeah.
Yes, although I will say that problem was working itself both ways. You know, they weren't hearing each other.
So Luther wasn't hearing them just as much as they were.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a standard Lutheran. Our line has always been, you kicked us out, not we left. You know, like Luther was excommunicated, we didn't leave. You know, and like that's always been.
And you mentioned that before. Luther was trying to reform the church.
Right. He was trying to get this big council meeting to reform the church, and never really happened. You know, and by the time it did, he was kicked out, and Lutherans were their own thing. So yeah, I mean, they were blaming him. I think they were blaming him for saying something he wasn't saying. You know. I will also, in the interest of Christian charity, say Luther was blaming them for things they weren't saying, which is why when we finally, after years and years of dialogue, sat down in 1999 and hashed it out, Lutherans in the Catholic Church signed this thing called the Joint Declaration on Justification, where we finally said, we don't actually disagree on this issue. And part of that was like, was this realization of both sides going, that's what you were saying? You know, like, not, and, you know, Catholics will still do this today sometimes, but, you know, like it took even Catholic theologians being like, we thought you were saying this. We didn't realize you were saying that. You know, like that we don't have a problem with, you know, and so we signed the document that said, it didn't say we fully agreed. It said, our differences on this issue no longer need to divide us on this issue. You know, that we still have differences, but they're no longer church dividing differences, you know.
So if they're no longer church dividing, will they once again merge at some point?
For the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, the Lutheran Catholic dialogue had, I think it was 31 areas of dialogue, 30 areas, and we agreed on 17. So
we've got 13 to go before.
More than half. That's good news, you know. But we don't fully agree yet. Our main differences are what we call ecclesiology at this point. Ecclesiology is doctrine of the church. Mm-hmm. What do you believe about the church? Who has power? How do you organize the church? Who can be ordained? Who has power?
Yeah.
You know,
So it's the more, for want of a better term, it's the more secular aspects of
yeah, I mean, they're theological issues, right? Should a woman be ordained? Mm-hmm. Theological issue, but it's also an organizational issue, right? Okay. You know, and that's the thing with ecclesiology is that it is theological, but it's also organizationally rooted, you know, and so like a big one in the Catholic Church, the local bishop has authority, right? Mm-hmm. You know, and authority over his parish, right? And so power is rooted in the bishop, ultimately in the Bishop of Rome, who's an elected absolute monarch, you know, but authority is rooted in the office of the bishop. We have bishops, but ultimately for us, authority is rooted in the church, the congregation, specifically the church council in our denomination, but in the congregation is. So my bishop cannot give me a direct order. My council could, the congregation can give me a direct order. My bishop actually technically can't give me a direct order. Now, if she did, I would obey it because I respect her.
Yeah.
And I out of tradition and my self-preservation and, I give her that authority. But, technically speaking, and she knows this, so she never actually gives me a direct order. She issues recommendations, and I can follow them or not. Most of the time I do because she's a wise woman and, I actually think she's pretty smart on a lot of these things, so COVID was a good example of this. I kind of followed her recommendations to the letter, for the most part, didn't have to because she can't give me an order in my own church.
That's fascinating. Well, given that,
But so that's a theological issue, but it's also a major difference, right? And we would. There's this line in one of the other confessions that says we would obey the Bishop of Rome if he but taught the gospel, But like therein lies the issue, right? Obedience is secondary to the gospel. And to this separates us from some other Protestants too. I don't take an oath of obedience to my bishop. I take an oath of obedience to Scripture and the confessions. But I don't got any oath of obedience to any national bishop, local bishop, whatever.
Yeah. But you said it. Some Protestants do. So
well, Episcopalians do, right? They preach, teach, and obey. It's very much in their ordination vows and. Obey is that's not a word in mine,
Yeah.
So.
My daughter would agree with that. But,
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're a good Lutheran, right? So our differences are those kind of things, right? Who has power in the church and why? And not just organizationally, but theologically, who has power, We still have a difference over what defines church. We haven't gotten to Article 7, but we define the true church as anywhere the sacraments are rightly performed and the gospel is rightly preached. That defines the existence of the true church. They would say being in communion with Rome with the Bishop of Rome defines the true church, right? Existing in communion and apostolic succession through Rome, that makes the true church.
Yeah.
When we would be like, nah, no.
You got that messed up.
Right.
Wow.
So that's all what we labeled under this broad category of ecclesiology,
Yeah.
which is doctrine of the church, how the church operates and why.
Wow. This is cool.
Yeah.
It's opening up a lot of understanding of just what it's all about and why the separation happened.
Yep.
But we've got to stop here.
Okay.
We're going to take it from, it's going to be a logical flow of the new obedience. It's going to be
Yeah, right.
So that'll be a perfect flow point and transition point. So when are we back? Next week
Next week I'm on vacation. Week after that.
And then we have a meeting.
And then we have a council meeting after. So 3 weeks, September, first Sunday in September.
First Sunday in September? Or like August 31st maybe?
I think we got a council meeting that's happening on the 31st.
All right, so the rest of the month will probably be off.
Right, we're off the rest of the month. First Sunday in September we are back.
And we'll get into the new obedience.
Yes.
That'll be our topic.
Yes.